Great. So thank you all for coming so much. My name is Riley Brasse. I just finished my doctorate at Arizona State University, and this project is all about evidence-based strategies for learning and practice. So I apply a lot of the principles to clarinet, but the ideas work for learning just about anything. So the first thing I'd like you to think about is, what would you like to be able to learn faster or perform better? And that could either be something on your instrument, it could be something for work or school or even a sport. So, for a little bit of context, practice changes the brain and is the most important part of learning anything. This is all about evidence-based strategies and 3 requirements for learning: intense focus, deliberate repetition, and deep rest. The first step for my dissertation project was to identify resources and research trends in cognitive science fields. That included sport and performance psychology, neuroscience, and music education. To apply what I found, I strategically learned the Nielsen Clarinet Concerto. And I think 2 years ago, I presented at ICA for the research competition and ended up winning second prize. And that was kind of the foundations for this paper. So my goal for this presentation is that you'll gain a few specific practice strategies and a better understanding of some foundational learning principles, time to plan your next practice session, and new perspectives from other people. Those perspectives might come during this presentation in the chat, or just anyone you talk about these ideas with throughout your day or anytime in the future. There's a few ways that you can get the most out of this session as well. The first is active engagement. I'll talk a lot about how active focus and engagement is a requirement for learning. So even if it's just thinking these ideas over in your own head, having a discussion with yourself, that processing will be super helpful for applying any of this. The next, you can actually bring these strategies into the practice room, because the more you can try them out and experiment with them for yourself, the more helpful it'll be. Next up, you can teach anything that resonates with you to your students, colleagues, or anyone who might benefit from this information. And last, you can get good sleep tonight. I'll talk a lot about rest throughout the presentation. One of the best ways that you can retain what you've learned throughout the day is to get good rest during the night. So with that, I'd like to give you about 30 seconds to consider the first kind of opportunity for active engagement. What would you like to practice? And what are maybe 2 or 3 words that describe your best practice? So feel free to send that in the chat, or even just think about it for yourself. The next 30 seconds are yours to think about that. Be faster. Nice. All right, so I'll definitely have some strategies for speed and a few structures that I think will be helpful for you. So let's start with the most important information. If you remember one slide from this whole thing, it should be this one, because these are all of the foundational principles that the rest of the strategies are based on. First, most learning happens during rest. This is like road work in the brain. We need to take the cars off of the road for new construction, and we need to rest for the brain to change. That's also part of why babies sleep so much, because their brains are changing really fast. And rest even includes the seconds between deliberate repetitions, when our brain is automatically replaying and recombining neural activity. But then we still need to put the work in. And when it comes to those repetitions, neural pathways are less like roads and more like trails through a dense forest. When we use the same path over and over, it gets faster and easier to follow. We build habits. But excessive mindless repetition is a terrible practice strategy that will quickly lead to habituation, not noticing what you're doing, and even potentially overuse injuries that for some people can be career-ending. So then the main question is how we can get the benefits of repetition without the drawbacks. Some of the main ways are by spacing those reps out, using creative and mindful variations, and having a crystal clear goal for each rep. The goal is not just repetition, it's to improve or notice something new every time. To do that, we need focus and active engagement. Most of our focus comes from health foundations, things like sleeping well, exercising, and eating well. Then to direct that intense focus, we have to have motivation, clear achievable goals, and feedback. So I'm going to start this next section with a quote from a real neuroscientist because I am just a clarinetist who likes neuroscience. So the adult brain is not only capable of changing, but does so continuously throughout life in response to everything we do and every experience we have. I'd highly recommend this book if you want a concise and accessible introduction to current neuroplasticity research. It's really interesting. And overall, I also want to mention that neuroplasticity is not good or bad. It's just about change. So anytime we learn something new and the brain changes, that's neuroplasticity. As you recover from a traumatic brain injury and make new pathways, that's another example. And even just the natural course of aging. Now, there are some maladaptive or negative possibilities for neuroplasticity, like focal dystonia is a neurological condition where you lose control over fine muscle movements that have just been repeated too much. So with all of that, I also want to mention why neuroplasticity is such an important topic in my own life. It's been 10 years and 3 months now that this research has been kind of guiding some of my main life choices. I came into my first undergraduate audition as a civil engineering major. And the professor who heard my audition invited me back for a pretty life-changing conversation. Within 30 seconds of meeting this guy, he asked me, Riley, will you ever be happy not making music? And even then I said, well, no, I'm probably going to do this the rest of my life, even if I'm doing something else too. But I was honestly terrified to pursue a career as a professional musician or even a music major because I didn't have some of the skills I thought I would need and I would need. I hadn't sung a note since the voice cracking days of middle school choir. I'd never taken a piano lesson. So even though I was a pretty decent clarinetist, I was nervous that it was already too late for me to learn those skills. So my professor heard that, and we had a long conversation about neuroplasticity, how it's possible for the brain to change and for us to learn new challenging skills throughout life with the right motivation and strategies. I'm especially grateful that the brain continues to change throughout life because my first college teaching position was for a aural skills class where I needed to sing and play piano pretty much every day. So let's jump in now to a super quick introduction to the nervous system. This comes back to the idea of neural pathways being like a path through a forest. Neural pathways are how the body sends signals for everything. Every thought, perception, emotion that we have is all chemical and electrical messages being sent along neural pathways. The more we repeat the same path, the easier it gets to use. Another way this is like a path through a forest is pretty much the only way to erase that path is to not use it and just to let it fade over time, which is easier said than done in a lot of cases, but is an essential part of learning just as much as the active work that we do. However, sometimes the best way to find a better path from point A to point B is to just try things and experiment, and we will make mistakes, and that's an essential part of learning as well. So as we're constructing those paths, it's both the quantity and the quality of practice that we put in that leads to expertise. Deliberate practice research, which was founded by Anders Ericsson, comes up in pretty much any resource that you'll look at that discusses the science of skill. So Ericsson summarized some of the key qualities of deliberate practice, and this is condensing a large body of research into a few words, but he mentions that we need clear goals, motivation, feedback, repetition, and intense focus. So those are all kind of nested within my three. And one is missing from that list, rest. But in the original study on deliberate practice, where they looked at musicians in an elite conservatory, they found the top performers were sleeping far more than their peers and even taking afternoon naps. So even though this didn't make Erickson's shortlist, I wanted to emphasize it in my paper and a lot of the information I share on this topic. So just to explain the graph really quick, that bottom line where we have something we've done over and over throughout life, maybe like driving or using a fork. You can spend thousands of hours, but it's no guarantee that you'll necessarily get better. Living in Arizona with people who have been driving for decades and still can't use turn signals, I can definitely attest to this effect. But if we have those qualities of deliberate practice, we can continue to gain skill throughout our lives. So I'd like to start kind of at the end of the process with rest. Again, this is like new construction in the brain. When we're actively using our neural pathways, or when we're practicing, that sends the signals that new construction needs to start, and that the memories that are stored in our short-term memory can be transferred to long-term. The best way to do this is pretty standard advice of spacing out our practice. So rather than cramming for 4 hours right before a lesson or performance, spread that out throughout the week or even longer period. This can also be easier said than done. And one of the best ways to do that is to just schedule your practice, ideally at the same time each day, to build those habits and kind of offload the mental work of finding time to do it in the first place. To make that spaced practice stick, we need to sleep. Oh, I want to go back to one example of how you can space out your practice as well. So I had one day where I felt I just made amazing progress from the beginning to the end. And part of that was spacing out 4 individual practice sessions, starting with a warm-up, having 2 afternoon sessions separated by a deep rest session, and then a review at the end of the day. So the space practice applies on longer time frames from a week to months, even to a single day, where we limit our practice only as long as we can maintain intense focus. So after all that spacing out throughout the day, deliberately planning your practice, we just need to get good rest, especially the last 2 hours of an 8-ish hour sleep cycle are going to be essential for motor memory consolidation. So this is Dawson. He is my helper for rest in learning. First, a great way to set your circadian rhythm is to just get more bright light early in the day. That'll help you feel more alert early on, and that sets your body's internal clock to feel sleepy later in the day. But there's even a lot of benefits for deep rest after learning, like taking a walk, a nap, or meditation. So Dawson is kind of a double whammy for this. He helps me after practice by taking a 10 to 30 minute walk and helping me get better sleep. He also doesn't care about how good I am at clarinet or anything like that. So it's nice to have the reminder to focus on the important things in life, walks and sleep. Now, so we've had those levels of spacing out your practice over weeks, getting a night of sleep, getting 30, 20 minutes of deep rest. Now we're down to the seconds. Even those brief pauses between repetitions will be essential for learning. And that can be, oh, this is going back to the deep rest one there. So a micro break, returning to that idea, can be just a second to take a deep breath, to stretch, have a drink of water, just enough to kind of reset and refocus. I'd like to share one of the most interesting studies I found throughout this research on micro breaks. They had one group practicing a piano pattern just continuously, and another practiced the same pattern, but for 10 seconds on and then 10 seconds off. During the breaks, those 10 seconds off, they found that the same neural activity was being replayed, but 20 times faster than the actual physical movements. So this isn't to say that 10 seconds on, 10 seconds off is the perfect or magic number for micro breaks, but that the pauses between your repetitions are just as valuable as the actual movements themselves. So with that, I'd like to give you 1 minute to take a quick micro break. You can get up and breathe, stretch, get some water, take some notes on whatever's interesting for you. The next minute is yours. Okay, about 10 seconds left, and we'll get rolling with the next section. Oh, looks like I paused it. All right, I hope that little break was restorative and refreshing and helped you consolidate some of the memories from what we've talked about so far. Let's jump into repetition. I want to start this section by mentioning some of the drawbacks of repetition if it's not used deliberately. First, there's habituation, or whenever something is repeated over and over or just constantly, our brains naturally respond to it less. This is like being nose blind to a smell in your own house, then coming back after 2 or 3 weeks of vacation and thinking, oh, this is what this place actually smells like. So first of all, excessive repetition means we maybe won't be noticing important details. It can also lead to overuse injuries like tendinitis, vocal dystonia, or nasopharyngeal collapse, or when you start getting that kind of grunt when your soft palate isn't sealing. So then the key question is, how can we get the benefits without those drawbacks? As we're considering that, it's really helpful to know why repetition is still essential for learning. To start with, muscle memory is not literally in the muscles, it's in the nervous system. One of the key mechanisms behind that feeling of muscle memory is called myelination. Myelin is like the insulation on an electrical wire, but it does more than insulate neural pathways. It helps speed up the signals and make them more fluent and more automatic. A book called The Talent Code, which is an excellent review on some of the best training programs for anything from sports to music, sums this up saying, skill is myelin insulation that wraps around neural circuits and grows according to certain signals. The most important signal that we can control for this is repetition. But myelin doesn't get all of the credit for this. We also have an area of the brain called the cerebellum. It's right about here. It means little brain in Latin, and it helps us coordinate sequences of timing and movements that feel automatic. So timing and automatic movements are both essential for music. So we're training our cerebellum and myelinating neural pathways. I'd like to share a quick quote from an article that Bob Spring at ASU has been distributing for decades about slow practice and the cerebellum. Slow practice is the key to rapid technical progress. The cerebellum is a non-judgmental part of the brain. It assumes that any repetitive activity in the muscular system is being repeated because the conscious mind is trying to make it automatic. The cerebellum will be just as efficient an automatizer of incorrect sequences of timing as of those that are correct. So as we're practicing, we need to respect how limited our short-term or working memory really is. There's a lot of ideas that we can only hold about 4 to 7 individual chunks of information in our mind at one time. That's part of why phone numbers are around 7 digits, and you'll see that in a lot of places as well. The only way to expand those limits is to transfer those short-term memories into long-term memory and build better mental representations for the task. The first step is breaking it down and making it as easy as possible so we can repeat those successes and grow. But perfection is not necessarily the goal of slow practice. It's to make better errors. So this really interesting study looked at the difference in perception between novices and experts. They had musicians ranging from high schoolers to experienced professionals. They had them record themselves playing and then listen back to their own recording. As they listened, they noted every time they had an error or something that was a bit different than their ideal vision for the piece. The high schoolers had about the same number of errors that they identified in their own playing as the experts. The difference, though, is the experts were making better mistakes. Rather than wrong notes and rhythms, the professional players were noticing differences in inflection. Maybe that wasn't quite as expressive or interesting as they wanted to play. Maybe it was slightly out of tune or slightly a different tone than they really wanted. Maybe it was a microtiming issue where the rubato just wasn't quite working. They were noticing better mistakes. So while we can't immediately raise our skill level or perceptual abilities, we can simplify the task to the point that we can make those expert level errors, make the notes and rhythms and all of that as easy as possible so that you can focus on making music that's worth listening to. Once you have those small chunks, you link them together in bigger and bigger groups and repeat your successes while using errors as essential information. Another way that we can bridge the benefits and drawbacks of repetition is with varied repetition. So rather than doing it the same way each time, a little bit of variation makes it more applicable to new situations or generalizable. It reduces habituation with that little bit of novelty, and we can use specific strategies to solve specific problems. So one example is using rhythm. A problem of slow practice is that the movements for playing slow will often be different than how we need to move to play fast. Playing fast requires much more kind of velocity and efficiency in our movements than we can get away with in slow practice. A great and simple way to address that is with dotted altered rhythms. So this might even look like a double dotted eighth note and a faster short note to see if we can play with the same velocity that we will need to for fast playing, but still with the accuracy that we can get from slow playing. There's a ton of other rhythm variations that you can use as well. I've just given two as kind of a starting point. We can also vary the articulation for expressive and technical reasons. If it's normally staccato, we can slur it or play it legato to focus on air straight. If it's normally slurred, we can articulate it to focus on rhythm and even add subdivided articulations. You can also change up the style, especially with something fairly bland like scales. See what it's like to play the same passage like it's jazz or like it's Mozart or Freddie Mercury, whoever, and see what that brings into your playing, what new things you notice, and even new ideas that you didn't expect might work. And last, even if it sounds the same to someone outside the practice room, that does not mean that our brains have to be doing the same thing each time. Every repetition is an opportunity to notice something new or pay attention to a new experience. I'd like to share a quick and easy tool for this is 3x3. So the first step is aiming for 3 repetitions in 3 consecutive successes. Once you do that, you pick 3 different ways to do it. So those dotted rhythms are a great place to start with this. That was the first time I heard about this strategy. I was in a masterclass where the player had the student use 3 different rhythms 3 times each in a passage in the Debussy Rhapsody, and it cleaned things up really quickly. This is a great way to get both quantity and quality repetitions. And for those variations, you can add any of the things we mentioned before: articulation, style, rhythm, or even just focus. After you have those successful 9 total reps, bump up the challenge, whether that's a little bit faster tempo, a little bit longer chunk, or a little bit more complex of a passage. So shifting gears again, we're coming back to the idea that focus is required for effective repetition. I bet everyone watching this has experienced a moment where you could do something in the practice room, but then just bombed in a lesson or performance. That happens in declarative skills as well, where we just forget a name or forget something we could do at one point. And that comes from an illusion of mastery. Most of this is from relying on practice that uses short-term memory to hold things in your mind versus retrieving information from long-term memory. And those are related but distinct skills. The first step is to hold it in your short-term memory. Then we need to train our retrieval. This is also why flashcards work so much better than just rereading information. Actively working to recall memories makes them more stable in the future. So every time we have a dress rehearsal in music, we're applying active retrieval. We're trying to do it in the same context as performance. Now, we can break that down into smaller chunks as well. One of the best ways to practice retrieval is recording yourself, trying to keep it in the same context as a performance. So playing through any mistakes, but only doing it in about a phrase or so to start with. This adds a little bit of performance pressure and gives us essential feedback about our own playing. Next, we can even simulate the physical effects of performance anxiety. Like if we have a little bit faster heart rate when you perform, you can do a few jumping jacks, move a little bit, go up some stairs, and then try playing your excerpts or the intro to a solo. Or you can even add distraction intentionally to see, can I still perform this even when it's not the most optimal condition? So I've given you two seemingly conflicting ideas. Break it down and make it easy versus build it up and make it hard. So the best way to think about this is by the stage of your learning process that you're in. At first, toward the bottom of this graph, will be in the cognitive stage, where everything is effortful. You have to think through every movement, how you're making an embouchure, how you're moving your hands. Then, as you start getting more fluent, building new ideas, you're in the associative stage. That's where we can start using those bigger chunks, faster tempos. And last, when it starts to feel automatic, or we start to have that experience of muscle memory, that's, first of all, when we can just let go and play. That's where we want to be for a performance. And second, if you're practicing and you've already reached that stage, aim for overlearning or doing it a little faster than you'll need to in performance, memorizing things that you won't have to play from memory or any way to make it more stable. One example that we can use for overlearning is distraction or adversity training. So I want to share a quick clip. This is from around 2016. And I asked my undergraduate studio to throw paper balls at me while I played to see if I could focus even with this kind of novel, strange situation. And it worked really well. So I'm glad that that clip exists because it demonstrates some good principles for this as well. If you can make adversity training even goofy or fun and still focus through it, you're setting yourself up for a great ability to focus during performance as well. So it doesn't necessarily have to be grueling or strenuous to do this adversity training. It can be goofy and experimental as well. So I'd like to share another strategy when we're starting to reach that associative or autonomous stage of learning. Normally, the most common structure for a practice session is to do a big block on one thing, a big block on another, big block on a last thing. So that's called blocked practice. In interleave practice, we intentionally break things up into smaller chunks and cycle through them. So you might take what you would normally spend 15 minutes on and do 3 5-minute chunks on 3 different things. Or we can put that into a random order, which has similar benefits. This works for a few different reasons. First, we're applying retrieval practice by giving ourselves just a second to forget what we had previously focused on. Now, there are trade-offs with that. You don't want to give yourself too much time to forget so that you can still leverage that benefit from short-term memory. This also introduces contextual interference, which has pros and cons, much like the retrieval practice aspect. By interfering with kind of the flow of our practice, we're making our brains reset, and that effort makes you better and better at getting into the flow next time. Again, that has to be traded off with how familiar are you with the skill already? how much effort will be spent with interference, and how much benefit will it gain long-term. So a third function behind interleaving is that we can compare different material. So this might be something like, can I play lyrical passages with the same intense focus and rhythmic energy as my fast passages? Can I play my fast passages with the same tone quality and phrasing as my lyrical work? And overall, this typically has better long-term retention, but possibly diminished short-term gains. So the end of your practice session, the tempo might be a little less than if you had just done the same thing 100 times in a row. But next time you pick up your clarinet, it'll be more effective later. We can also use our mastery-based goals and repetitions for interleaving rather than a time interval. So this sticky note game came from Molly Gebrian's work. She's a violist with a background in neuroscience. She has a great book about practice and the brain and a bunch of YouTube resources as well. So I'd highly encourage you to check out Molly Gebrian's stuff, and that's in the handout for this presentation. So in the sticky note game, the first step is picking 3 to 7 shortish passages of your music. If you can play it 5 times in a row, you put 1 tally mark on the sticky note. And we can adjust those rules to the situation at hand too. That might be anywhere between 1 to 10, depending on your needs at the time. Then you go to the next in a random order. So you still have your list, you're still structured, but you can randomly cycle through the order that you're focusing on. If you make a mistake, you just erase all of the tallies on the sticky note and start again. This is another place where we can vary the rules to meet the needs of the situation. Earlier on in learning, give yourself a lot more leeway. So maybe you have 2 or 3 mistakes until you have to erase all of the tally marks. It also encourages mental rehearsal before the actual repetition. It makes you stop and think through the passage and kind of give that mental trial run before actually playing it. This also makes sure we're focusing on what is most challenging and needs the most attention. Because once you get 5 tally marks on your sticky note, you take it off, you don't have to focus on it anymore. If that takes 3 minutes, great. If it takes 15, that's fine too. We're focusing where we need the most attention. So here's like one quick example of that in the Nielsen concerto. This comes from an actual practice session I did. I had a few contrasting sections. So for example, I had labeled number A there. That was all about the weird visual notation in this section, where it's all the double flats and register crossing. B was another technical passage throughout the whole range of the instrument. C gave me a chance to focus on lyricism and rubato, kind of returning to those musical foundations, being as relaxed and expressive as I could be. And then same with D, another tricky technical passage that I just needed a little bit more work on. I finished C quickly and moved on. B took a lot longer, and that also told me that maybe my chunk was a little too big, and I should break those up into smaller sections to focus on accuracy before just taking in more information than short-term memory can process. With that, let's come back to focus. So focus has a few different components. First is our physical state of being, the connection between our body and our attention. Most of that will come from health, like I mentioned before. And it also will come from our just alertness, which might depend on what time of day it is, how stressful the situation is, and a bunch of different factors. Then we need to have clear goals. This is like learning to throw darts. You need to be able to see the target. In music, we need to be able to hear what we want to play in our head before we play it, or in other words, audiation. It can also be more explicit goals, whether that's the number of repetitions that you want to get in, or specific career or performance opportunities that you'd like to pursue. Another essential element I want to re-emphasize is to limit the duration of our practice sessions to only as long as we can maintain intense focus. So coming back to that idea of physical alertness and arousal, this is a pretty well-established concept that our best performance happens when we're not too relaxed and sleepy, and not too stressed and anxious. It's like tuning a violin string. We want to be right in that sweet spot. There are a few ways that we can adjust our level of physiological arousal as well. One of the best ones is breathing. Conscious breathing affects our autonomous nervous system, or the things that we normally can't control otherwise. Things like heart rate, blood pressure, digestion. So I'd like to share a quick strategy with you. This is one of many different conscious breathing tools called box breathing. I would imagine that a lot of you have probably heard of this before. The structure is pretty simple. You breathe in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, hold for 4. So let's do maybe just 2 cycles of that together, about 30 seconds, and just monitor how you feel before and after box breathing. Last one. All right. So I love building these into my presentations because I find myself speaking a lot slower and in a more centered way. It kind of helps me reset the flow. There's a lot of different ways we can use breathing strategies like this. Whatever your specific numbers are, these are great for a pre-performance ritual when you're sitting backstage, kind of getting ready to walk out. They're great for wind players who are working on our breath control as well, just learning to consciously reach our full lung capacity in a relaxed, easy way. And they take a perfect amount of time for a quick micro break, especially if you're using those repetition strategies and start getting frustrated. A 16-second break to do a box breathing cycle can be incredibly helpful for your mental focus and your physical state of ease. So the other best way that we can affect our autonomic nervous system, our arousal and focus, is with exercise. This is pretty much a magic bullet for the brain. And that happens for a few reasons. The brain, just like our muscles, is consuming oxygen and nutrients. In the short term, just a little bit of light cardio, even 15, 10 minutes, can get essential nutrients to our brain, which improves our alertness, our cognitive performance, and even mood. This isn't necessarily to say run a marathon or do your max deadlift right before practice. That will probably be a bit too strenuous. But if we can find that sweet spot, just to get a little bit of blood flowing, get your mental and physical alertness in its best place, it'll be hugely helpful for learning. And then exercise has incredible long-term benefits as well. This will help delay cognitive decline, things like Alzheimer's and dementia. People who exercise throughout their lives typically have better hippocampal volume, or a really essential area of the brain. And it's even possible for neurogenesis to happen, or the creation of new neurons. That's pretty scarce in adult brains and only happens in specific parts of the brain, but it is more common in people who have exercised throughout life. With that, I'd like to give you one more 1-minute break. For this one, I'd encourage you to get up, move, stretch, however you want to kind of restore your physical and mental focus. I'll see you back in 1 minute. Oops, go back. About 10 seconds left until we'll kind of go for the final push to the end. All right, and welcome back. And here we'll keep going to the next section, more of our conscious focus. So there's a body of research called self-regulated learning theory. This comes mainly from education domains, starting with K-12 education, and it's been applied to music as well. Self-regulated learning breaks down the process of practice into three main steps: forethought, performance, and self-reflection. So in forethought, we'll be doing things like planning, setting goals, and analyzing the task at hand. Performance includes doing the thing and monitoring our attention in the moment. And then in self-reflection, we ask the most important possible question for practice: why? So either why something was working, why you were successful and what you want to do more of, or why something's not quite working and what you can change and do in the future as you come back to that forethought phase. One way to apply self-regulated learning in our practice is with a journal or a template. So this is one example of a practice journal template that I've used for myself and my students. The first step is just writing down when and where you're going to practice, reducing that mental effort of getting started next time. From there, you want to really specifically identify what do you want to accomplish? What are the passages? What are the tempos? What are kind of the expressive goals that you're working towards? I intentionally don't give myself too much space for this because practice might develop over the course of the actual learning experience. Things don't always go according to plan. But having just a few seconds to write important bullet points is hugely helpful. Then the how part. So I hope that this presentation and the strategies we talk about today will give you a few ideas for the how will I do it section of your practice. Then in reflection, the first question to ask is, why were you successful? That's very deliberately placed as the first question here because our brains have a natural tendency to focus on negatives. And yes, that is essential for progress, identifying our weaknesses and training them to become stronger. But it can also be really demoralizing over time if you're only ever focusing on the flaws in your playing. Every single practice session that you will ever do has something that's worth doing again. Even if that's just getting the instrument out of the case that day, that is a valid success and worth repeating. Then we can identify the specific remaining challenges and make a plan for how we'll tackle them next time. The more you can plan your next practice session while it's still fresh, the better you'll find yourself at the start of that next session. You'll already know what to do and how to do it. It's just a continuation without that friction of getting started. So I'd like to wrap up things a little bit. So let's see, I don't have the chat visible on mine. So if you could possibly unmute yourself and call out maybe one or two of the things that you've remembered about focus. What are some ways that we can improve our focus during practice? And I can't see the chat at the moment. So if there's any answers in there, feel free to call those out as well.
Yeah, remove distractions.
Remove distractions. Excellent. Yes. So I'll go ahead and share mine for this one. So some of the bullet points for this, there's way more out there, but these are three good ones. First, have really clear goals, either written in a practice journal or even just mentally kind of as a check mark before you get started. Finding your physical focus, things like breathing, stretching, and exercising, and then limiting the duration of our sessions, only as long as you can maintain quality focus. So then we have repetition. So I'll give you a few seconds to either share or just reflect on strategies for repetition, and then I'll give you my short list. Okay, I hope you had a second to reflect there. So the first that I'd recommend, break it down, make it easy and doable, and then build it up. That's pretty standard practice advice, but it's standard for a reason. So slow practice and small chunks and incremental improvement, even if that's just 2 or 3 clicks on your metronome. Then we can make sure we're using active retrieval for our repetitions. So not just holding things in short-term memory, but recalling them from long-term memory. In music, that might be recording yourself, mock performances, or even seeing, can I retrieve this information in the same physical state that I'll perform it in by getting your heart rate up or adding distraction. Then we can interleave our practice, adding contrast between different sections so we can start to build new connections, and adding a bit of deliberate challenge, the effort of getting started on a new section to make sure that we can do it in performance. Then we can vary our repetition. Things like style, articulation, tempo. In any of those ideas, you can use the 3x3 tool for 3 times, 3 different ways. And then we have rest, where most of the learning happens. So I'll give you a few more seconds again to consider what your takeaways from rest were, and then I'll share my shortlist. Okay, here we go. So the first thing we can do is space out our practice sessions, whether that's over the course of a day, weeks, or months even. We can make sure we're sleeping enough to get quality practice, and I have a few resources for sleep in the handout as well. Then we can even take micro breaks of just a few seconds between repetitions, especially if you're getting fatigued, refreshing with a stretch, take a water, or a sip of water, or taking notes can help us leverage our brain's natural tendency to replay and recombine neural activity. And last, we can rest deeply after practice, whether that is a walk where you just kind of let your brain relax, a nap, or a meditation. All right, I'd like to give you a few minutes to plan your next practice session. I'll give you 3 minutes. I even have some nice fall music on the timer I found for this one. So the main goals are to find when and where you're going to practice, what you'll work on, and how you'll do it. I also have the link as a QR code to the handout, and that's posted in the chat at the beginning there. So the next 3 minutes are yours, and then we'll have a bit of time for questions and discussion. Accidentally pause the timer there. We'll jump forward. seconds left. All right, I hope you had some time to kind of apply these ideas or review some of the main concepts in the handout. I'm going to build a few seconds in for any questions that you guys might have, or maybe if you'd like to share any of the things that you want to practice or what your main takeaways were.
Anybody have questions, please feel free to put those in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask Riley that question. I personally have a question. I
Yeah.
wanted to ask you, in your experience working with younger students at the undergraduate level, do you find when you implement this, there are some common things that they get wrong initially with planning out practice sessions? Or, I mean, in my in my experience teaching younger students, I find that they're very overwhelmed with day-to-day activities, and they're easily distracted with other coursework and things like that. So finding the opportunity to really have a dedicated practice time may be a challenge for them. So I really like the concept of planning things out and giving them the opportunity to sort of take ownership of that, because I think the sooner you do that, the sooner they can set themselves up for success over the long period. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I think a lot of the time, one of the main challenges is like just trying to do too much too soon in changing your practice. Because the more things that you're trying to adjust at once, the more divided your attention's going to be. So like starting as simple as possible, like you said, with just finding the time for it. I think it's also repetition is one of the biggest like kind of pros and cons, I think, for musicians of any level. But like I really try to clarify for my students that it's more probably the quality versus the quantity of repetitions that you're getting in. Especially some of my younger students will be like, yeah, I practiced for 30 minutes. I'm like, well, how many times did you actually play it right? They were like, once or twice.
Right.
But yeah, does that answer the question fairly well?
Yeah,
Or
no,
the other things?
I think so. I kind of am curious too. When you are transitioning from like a very um, bite-size practice session where you were talking about working on very small increments and building the technique over a period, when you're ready to transition into full run-throughs as you get close to preparing for a performance, how do you coach your students on the mindset shift of like we're working on very, very specific, minute details, but you have to have your mental capacity really flexed over a longer period of time where you can't take a break in between, say an 8 or 10 minute movement as you're playing through? How do you prepare them for that kind of mental shift?
I'd say definitely using review sessions, like either at the end of the day or the practice session, as a chance to really deliberately shift from, okay, I'm polishing this to I am performing it, and saying that, okay, even if I make a mistake, I need to keep going. I can't go back and make a face or um, pause in that moment. And so that's also, I really love self-recording for that as well. It's like it can be a really uncomfortable experience to hear yourself play or speak in a lot of cases, but getting comfortable with that, especially at the end of a practice session, is great for training both the mindset of just going through and performing, while also kind of getting, okay, these are the things I'm going to start with in my next practice session immediately.
Okay. And what about post performance? After a while, you're obviously many musicians struggle with over analyzing mistakes and focusing really heavily on things that they wish could have gone better. Do you have any suggestions on how to take the performance as it is as a whole and apply it to future practice sessions, taking into account that mistakes happen and that's part of being a musician?
The first thing I would always recommend, both for my own personal experience and some research to back it up, is wait to really get a bunch of feedback and reflect on your performance. It's not going to be the most conducive to progressing to deeply, dive into the recording right after you play. And there's some data that suggests, even with basketball players, they had them do a bunch of free throws one day and gave them immediate feedback versus feedback a day later with a self-recording, and having a little bit of space between taking in that feedback can be really helpful. Even for just the like emotional side of
Mhm.
performing, where you have just a little bit of space to distance yourself from those qualities and realize, oh yeah, that did sound good, or kind of let go some of the moments that were, rougher or didn't go the way you wanted them to.
Great. Anybody else have any questions for Dr. Brasse in the chat? I see a comment here from Henry saying, this webinar reminds me that practice makes permanent rather than practice mistakes over and over, learning to slow things down and play them correctly at a slower tempo. I think a lot of students, especially as you get further along in a preparation for a recital, may feel the need to push the tempo faster too
Yep.
soon, and you end up practicing those mistakes, and it becomes much more difficult to sort of unlearn those processes, but it's not impossible. So I think Riley suggested, listen to yourself, record yourself. You can hear much more intricate details to your playing when you're sort of stepping back instead of in the moment. We can feel things and shape them over the course of a practice session, but when you listen to a recording as you prepare, you're going to notice a lot more details that you wouldn't have heard prior.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think this was fantastic. As we mentioned, the resource is available on the website. Feel free to reach out to Riley on Instagram or Facebook, or by email if you have questions about his research. He did just complete his doctorate defense this week, so he is now Dr. Brasse, so we'll congratulate you on that. Our
Thanks.
next session is going to be taking place over on YouTube, a Potpourri Concert number 4. I have just put the link in the chat there for you, so you can click that and follow us over there, and we will see you again soon. Thank you so much, Riley.
Yeah. Thank you all for coming.